Hi, Mark. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Can you start with a little background? Talk about like how you got to the position that you have now at ServiceNow?
Sure. Well, I started here at ServiceNow 2 years ago. Currently, I own SEC reporting, technical accounting, and statutory reporting. So in those responsibilities, it's what you would expect. SEC reporting, I'm responsible for filing the 10Qs, 10K, get involved in some other SEC filings here or there as well, like the proxy and things of that nature. Stat reporting, we have 35 or so jurisdictions that we have statutory reporting requirements. So responsible for filing those timely and accurately. And then tech accounting, complex one-off transactions that come across our way. A lot of accounting research on either new standards or just things that are new for us, depending on the arrangement that we're entering into. And we're kind of like the consultative hub for the organization. On top of this, and a lot of what this conversation is going to entail, I'm co-leading with our sustainability team an ESG readiness procedures project. So primarily focused on CSRD, but we've worked on other regulatory areas in that realm as well, like UK CFD and things of that nature. But before ServiceNow, started my career at Deloitte. I was there for approximately 10 years in audit in the New York office, left as a senior manager and took a job in private at a company called Citrix. I was there for 10 years, another technology company, and mainly held roles that were in technical accounting or international accounting, whereas ended up an international controller there for all of our international operations. And
Hmm.
then found the ServiceNow role, and the rest is history.
hmm And how much of like ESG is a like how much of your day to day would you say has to do with ESG? Or is it a small portion? Is it like the majority?
It's a large portion these days
Uh-huh.
because we're pretty heavy in our CSRD readiness, program,
Right.
and we're going through a double materiality assessment right now, which is extensive. And just marrying that up, because I haven't had additional ESG headcount on my team, at least at this stage, it's spreading the team thin. There's somebody on my team that helps me out a lot, plus myself, plus managing everything else that we have on our plate. So it's definitely made it a lot more challenging for sure, especially when I start getting into what's coming up, like October, which there's a good 3 week span every quarterly cycle where we're pretty crazy busy, where you're focusing on earnings, you're focusing on the queue, and every other regimented step in there between audit committee, disclosure committee, and all that.
hmm
It's hard to focus on ESG at that point, but we are working with the ESG sustainability team, and they take on a lot of the brunt during some of those phases. So it's kind of a balancing act. And one of the things we're figuring out right now is staffing and getting the team right size, not only for now, but what we're going to own ultimately down the road.
Right. That makes sense. And yeah, that's something that I definitely want to talk to you about in this conversation, the pipeline and finding the right candidates. Before we get into that, back up a little bit and if you could just define really the difference between an ESG controller, that role and the traditional controller role.
Yeah, traditional controller is going to be definitely more SEC financial reporting focused, making sure you're talking about closing the books and that's all accurate, understanding your ERP systems. And this is all kind of like table stake stuff. And obviously working towards improvements, things to do better, avoiding issues, addressing new standards and new transactions in the organization. ESG controller, there are a lot of similarities in regards to scope and what that role looks like, but it is regimented, at least in my opinion, to this regulatory environment, what's coming down the pike, and being somebody that's going to be an expert, that source of truth, the person that you consult with on these new standards, the person that's educating the organization, and ultimately the person that's responsible for reporting, making sure we're adhering to those timelines, we're ready for it, we're addressing the standards properly. Uh, educating the organization. It has a pretty varied or wide net of responsibilities, the same as an accounting controller. Uh, but this is a little bit more nuanced because a lot of people probably don't have the expertise or understanding in these areas, at least not to the level as they do with things that we've been doing forever, which is financial accounting reporting and closing the books and US GAAP and all that good stuff. There's nuances to ESG reporting that make it a little bit more challenging. But if I think about just scope of roles, there's a lot of similarities.
So talk to me specifically about how the ESG reporting process is structured at ServiceNow. You mentioned that it's really you and another individual, but then you have a sustainability team, it sounds like. So talk to me a little bit more about how it's integrated into, the larger financial reporting process.
Sure. And, I'll start with top level.
Mhm.
I think tone at the top is pretty critical for us to achieve our goals here. So our CFO chairs our ESG steering committee. So if you think about what she's responsible for in that role, guiding goals, progress, critical initiatives, really making sure we're aligned across the board there. ESG therefore sits in finance. We have that dedicated team that we're working with right now. That's an ESG sustainability team that really manages and focuses on a lot of related ESG activities, obviously. They own voluntary reporting. If there's inquiries that come through from customers, from investors, vendors, they're dealing with those and any other ESG centric items that might be coming down, the pike that we need to address. So from a voluntary reporting standpoint, we've been reporting voluntarily for the last 4 years. 2025 will be year five. And from a voluntary reporting standpoint, we manage it separately from financial reporting. This will change going forward as we move from a voluntary centric environment more so to a regulatory one. We will ultimately, adhere ourselves to gaining a lot of those scales of economy that we developed from an SEC reporting standpoint, and also that knowledge base, especially if you're going to be filing your CSRD report on a consolidated basis, following more of an SEC reporting mechanism. And then for anything that's really truly stat driven, like the new Australia rules or UK CFD, those will be more in the stat reporting sphere. But to get it ready, there'll be a lot of involvement between tech accounting SEC reporting on my team and the ESG team. Just from a readiness standpoint, once it's good to go, we probably foresee the stat reporting team owning that going forward with help from the other groups.
Tell me a little bit about voluntary reporting for those who don't know. Like what does that mean? And tell me about the change, the shift.
Yeah, so voluntary reporting, truly up to the company.
Mhm.
Initiatives that you might have, which would be like net zero emissions targets that you might have, which we do by 2030, what we're trying to do as a company just to get to certain social goals, environmental goals, or even talking about governance. It's really company centric in what we're thinking about. Granted, for us, we line a lot of that up to existing standards and requirements that are out there. So it's a really good starting point because I think we can leverage a lot of what's in there moving forward, even for CSRD, because we even have, scope one, scope two, scope three greenhouse gas emissions in there. We have some assurance that we use a third party on. So all of that's very helpful. We've developed minimal controls that will have to be revamped, but having voluntary reporting at least gives you a basis to start off of. You're not starting from scratch. Now, when you move to regulatory reporting, now you have a load of requirements that are mandatory. Some will be new, a lot will be new, and you have to adhere to certain timelines, make sure you get processes right, controls right, people are aligned. There's a lot more involved there.
So from what I'm hearing, it sounds like sustainability is incorporated, pretty deeply into the corporate strategy. And it sounds like this requires a degree of collaboration So talk to me a little bit more about that. I know you already touched on it, but tell me about collaborating with other departments on this.
Sure. And I'll start with just our collaboration. So my team, tech accounting, SEC reporting with the sustainability team, it's kind of a perfect marriage when you think about everything that we're trying to address here, because we have different strengths and abilities. ESG team, they are experts in data, metric collection, ESG rules, and just ESG in general, and the things that they've been seeing and hearing over the last several years. From a tech accounting SEC reporting team standpoint, we're very familiar with assessing materiality, understanding an internal control environment and SOX. We understand reporting considerations, dealing with auditors, limited and reasonable assurance. So you marry that all up, and if you can kind of gel well and make that work together and learn from them and they learn from you, it's kind of at least for us, a perfect opportunity to get to a point where we have a lot of the brain trust that we need for this and we can move forward, and there's not many holes at that point.
I know you talked already about how, busy it is, time consuming, and um, what are some of the ways that ESG reporting gets complicated? What are the challenges that you see today?
I think there's a lot of challenges when you think about ESG reporting, like no way to really sugarcoat it. Very challenging environment, complex environment, to boot, and it's ever changing. So you need to keep up to date with all global regulations, what could be impactful. Uh, Going back to what I brought up before, UK CFD, that was applicable for us this year. We filed our stat report with the UK earlier this month. It was a great starting point as a baseline because obviously much smaller scale to CSRD. But it gave us kind of that approach of working with a lot of stakeholders in the organization, building out reporting and disclosures that are going to go into a statutory filing, and working with service providers too. It was kind of like a small scale mini test of like what's to come for some of these larger regulations, and it worked well. So that was a good starting point and kind of gives us a flavor of what we're going to be encompassing going forward. But then I look at other global regulations and other changes and things that we have to keep up to date with. You have the new Australia rule that just came out. We're going to have other jurisdictions in the near term and long term that are going to start coming into play, probably mostly under ISSB. But those dominoes are going to fall, and before you know it, you're going to have not only CSRD, a potential SEC rule, and CFD in the UK and Australia. You're going to have all these other jurisdictions that become applicable, and it becomes pretty voluminous and challenging at that point. Another challenge that we run into, I think probably everybody is, the continual updates and clarifications from CSRD and really getting a hold of that standard because it's so complex and voluminous. That becomes a big challenge. And then on top of all of that, you still need to plan for the ones that may not even come to fruition. SEC rules on a stay. You can't put a blind eye to it. You need to make sure that you're still planning, getting to some kind of level of readiness for whenever that goes live and in what form it goes live in. So it's just a lot of moving parts in a lot of different directions. Some of it I think is leverageable where, I think about CSRD and the scope of that. A lot of the work you put into it, hopefully you can find some economies of scale where you can leverage that to other statutory ESG requirements that come down the pike. But that's the challenge, and you have a lot of different rules and there's nuances to them.
Yeah, incredibly challenging. You did mention, your team or that you don't have a huge team, but that it could be changing. But this is all still fairly new and not everyone has this expertise, as you said.
Yeah.
So we're talking a lot about the pipeline for finance and accounting. In your opinion, are students really being appropriately educated on ESG? And do you think that they're interested in this space? And I know you can't speak for an entire generation, but what are you seeing?
Speaking to people, I would say it's a mixed bag. Not that I've had extensive conversation with collegiates and their views on ESG. But to think about it, there's a high demand out there, and there's going to be a high demand of people that have this type of expertise. And I'm not saying you necessarily come out of college and you just start in that area, because I think there's a lot of benefit based on these ESG regulations to have an extended skill set beyond traditional financial reporting to get smarter on the topic. And I think we all need to get smarter on the topic, including myself. So we do a lot of internal research. We attend trainings, uh, some of them being the FIE conferences that you guys have had. We engage external specialists. If you have the budget, hiring FTEs is always an opportunity. People with requisite experience in the area. Uh, End of the day, it becomes a really costly endeavor, which makes it, I think, that much more challenging. Not every company is going to want to put millions of dollars to this. Some companies will, but to get to a proper readiness level, particularly for CSRD, you're going to have to be able to put some serious money to it, some serious time and effort to get to a point where you're ready. Unless you want to drag your team extremely thin, which I don't think is really going to go well for many people in the organization. It kind of brings back memories to me of Sarbanes-Oxley, and probably dating myself a little bit here, but 20 plus years ago when they came out with Sarbox, and that was a big challenge for, I would say practitioners, for auditors to go through that, you know, vast change in how we look at internal controls. And how do we implement it? How do we audit it? How's this going to work? And I actually feel like ESG is probably more challenging because back then you would hope that companies had internal controls. I would at least hope so. Maybe they weren't documented that well. This is kind of a different ballgame. ESG could be esoteric at times. There are areas within the field that, like double materiality assessment, that are just really nuanced. So it's a lot of things that an accountant can get their head around, but there's a lot of learning involved with it too. So going back to your question about students getting involved in it, I think there's going to be a big demand, which is great. So there's opportunity there, a lot to learn. I think a lot of it's also going to depend on their interests. But in my mind, I almost look at it more as a progression. Like if you have a strong accounting and reporting background, those are the people that will probably have a more seamless transition as opposed to somebody coming straight out of college and like trying to jump right into ESG.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you mentioned, you know, upskilling and trying to stay as up to date on all of the changes. How do you stay updated on the trends and the best practices? And what are some of the resources that you rely on?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's several ways I think to stay informed on what's going on in the ESG field. Uh, Webcasts, there's a ton of webcasts that are hosted by the Big Four and many other firms as well, and they're pretty regularly presented. So you can definitely get more educated along those lines. You can subscribe to ESG newsletters, keep up to date on current articles that are out there, and debriefs provided by the firms. Attend conferences, that is always something good. You can network during that as well. I think reading other company reports, be it voluntary or regulatory, is a huge one. And this will be, I think, very critical once we get into 2025, the earlier part of 2025, maybe like April and later, when you end up having those large public EU filers for CSRD start issuing their reports. So people that are in wave two, like a company that we are, we're going to be 2025 filing in 26. There'll be companies earlier than that. I think you're going to be able to get a wealth of information of those reports that come out. Problem with it, you can't wait for those reports and be like, all right, I'm going to start now. You got to start this process much earlier. But either way, it's going to give you just like a breadth of information in regards to benchmarking. And then I would say the last one for me would be benchmarking with peers. We do this often. We have a lot of peers, typically in the same space, technology companies, software companies, uh, meeting with them to go over where are you on your ESG journey? What have you learned so far? What are your challenges? What are things you're thinking about? What's top of mind? Bouncing questions off of them. You can learn from them. They can learn from you. And it's a good way of, kind of seeing where you are and potentially if you're a laggard or if you're ahead of the game. And it can open up your eyes to things that you weren't even thinking about.
Yeah, that's all great advice. And I've heard that a lot. The last question I want to ask you, Mark, is just where you see the ESG controllership role in the next 5 years. What do you think is in the future?
Yeah, I think probably a lot of change. But if the volume and complexity of ESG requirements continues to grow, which is really what I expect it to be, I foresee a dedicated ESG controllership, honestly, and I see one representing a critical component of finance. There's a lot of things that would encompass, like assessing new regulations, educating the org, like we discussed, uh, playing a critical role in documentation, the control environment, reporting responsibilities that are going to be expected of that team and what's necessary for ESG, managing audit requirements, uh, especially with, I think, where this will evolve. There's a lot of expectations out there that will move from limited assurance to reasonable assurance. So, really having that auditor relationship, understanding the audit requirements, the controls that need to be in place, most likely at that point, like SOX related controls. This will be all very critical. Uh, Very similar purpose to how I view a tech accounting SEC reporting or as it stands today. You're providing the right level of expertise and guidance throughout the organization. You're aligning processes, best practices, and you're doing this with the broader financial reporting process. So like it's kind of similar in that regard to what we're doing now, just in a very specialized area that is ESG. So next 5 years, long term, that's kind of where I see the ESG controllership evolving to.
You've probably seen it change even just in the years that you've been at ServiceNow. You said 2 years, right?
2 years, yeah.
So
Been
I
working on like
imagine
the
that.
ESG side less than that.
Uh-huh.
Probably like the last year and a half maybe. But yeah, ton of change and there has to be. Like it's something that it's not a nice to have. We need to be super intelligent on this and act on it. It's a requirement. So requires a lot of planning and you need buy-in from executive management and budget and support. If you have all of that, you're set up for success, but it's challenging, especially if you're not getting new headcount.
Yeah. Yeah, I can imagine. Well, Mark, thank you so much for your time and for your very thoughtful answers to my questions. And it's definitely going to be interesting to see how this space evolves. So thank you again for speaking with me today.
Of course, thanks for having me. It's good talking. Thanks, Olivia.
Thanks. For a deeper dive into these insights, be sure to download our report, FEI Engage Career Pathway ESG Controller, using the link on the screen.